Good evening. This is John Bushka, and tonight I want to talk about my third Do Ask Do Tell book, which was published in 2014, called Do Ask Do Tell: Speech is a Fundamental Right, Being Listened to is a Privilege. I know it's backwards, but we'll get an illustration up right now of the cover. And let me just run through what I wanted to say about it. First of all, this is basically a discussion, and it's in two parts. There's a nonfiction part and a fiction part, sort of like a final exam in a way. It's written in 2013, published by Ex Libris in early 2014. And the basic premise is that someone like myself, who is different from, let's frankly, male heteronormativity, is somewhat gender nonconforming and maybe and nonconforming in some other ways. If you're going to have a purpose, you're going to have a mission in life that is public, that becomes public and others understand and respect. First of all, I'm assuming that liberalism, as we know it, remains stable for now. I have to kind of give myself a dose of tough love and have to talk about what I have to do to come to terms with other people. I know it sounds a little bit double-edged, but this whole line of thought was came up before even some of the topics that are trendy today, gender identity, for example, or had barely been started discussing. So this is not about belonging to a marginalized group. This is about what I have to do as an individual. But based on my upbringing, which largely was in the 1950s, I graduated from high school in 1961. The world was a competitive place, and you had to kind of get good grades to escape the worst, worst risks of being drafted by the military, for one thing, if you were a male, and to not have a submissive position in the workplace. Now, it's not as true anymore. There's a lot more people can do for themselves without formal education than I think there used to be. Although that could have been debated, because my father, in some ways, was a self-made man back in the 1930s, but that's kind of how I perceived it. I was kind of a sissy boy, and I tended to compensate for that by interrupting others in class to get attention. That created problems. I didn't like what was expected of me as a boy, like hitting back and joining with others in fights if there was a problem. That was really problematic for me. I started taking piano in third grade, and I'm not quite sure why I wanted to, but I knew I had to. I was very good at it, and at puberty, I started developing a more positive identity about my own mission in life. It started to center on music, classical music, the idea that romantic music in the 19th century really was an innovation because it could manipulate people's emotions in ways that music hadn't before, as long as other things, books, game construction. I actually liked things like making outdoor baseball, wiffle ball stadiums and that kind of thing, and like the physics of some sports, especially baseball. But getting good grades, and grades were a kind of cryptocurrency, and they seemed to confer another path to respect. Now, later in high school, my homosexual interest in me and other boys that I thought were both strong and athletic and physical and good students and good people developed. It was what I would call upward affiliation. I actually identified with being male. I was very cisgender in my attitude. And I kind of, as developed in chapters 1 and 2 in this book, we're talking about music, and then I talk about high school, and I talk about how my erotic interest developed. I was sort of able to assimilate, and despite the setback of being thrown out of college, but then, over the latent homosexuality admission, and then going to school at home, and then going away again to graduate school and being an assistant math instructor and so forth, and then going through the Army, and then starting to work in 1970, and then coming out again in 1973 in New York City. And my life was sort of a concentric localism, but I started traveling more and I became involved in several groups, the Ninth Street Center, and then later on Understanding. So I had a certain kind of public identity, even in the 1970s, into the 1980s when I was living in Dallas. And that's all explained in chapters 1 and 2. Now, um, now I will say here that this is the nonfiction part of the book that sets up the argument that then is implied by the title of the book. That while free speech is a fundamental right, actually having people listen to you, that's a privilege. It's a conditional privilege. It's not privilege in the sense that the left means it. It's more like a privilege in getting a pass when you're in basic training or post privileges or something. It's something you earn relative to other people. Now, earlier concerns about conflict of my speech when I decided to write the first Do Ask, Do Tell book, and the first two have been promoted to booksellers and so forth, and I will explain more in another video why it's being done this way. But the earlier, the concerns back when I was writing it in the 1990s, because I was working with an insurance company that as an individual contributor that focused on military customers. And so later on, after I retired in 2001, after 9/11, was kind of forced to concerns over the attention I could attract. They could focus on my mother's safety when I was at home because I could attract negative attention. And also with the idea later on, starting maybe in 2016, 2017, after Trump was elected, and then after we had Charlottesville, gradually the tech industry started becoming more concerned that speech like mine, which was predicated on search engines, but even if it wasn't particularly augmented by algorithms, the way most of social media is, it could endanger people in protected groups. And if it was gratuitous, if it wasn't making a living from it, didn't really need it. It was depending maybe on inherited wealth or even wealth from other sources. Maybe that wasn't such a good thing. Concern. Now, this kind of concern is sort of reduced if you have your skin in the game, if you have people to be responsible for, dependents. And that's easy, that's easier to do if you have your own family, the natural way. And so that's what we mean by having to be creative in order to learn to care about other people constructively without infringing on them when you don't reproduce and when you ordinarily would be in a more subordinate position within a family or a tribe or something. Now, 2 more chapters in the book go over my personal history and in the workplace with the tendency after 9/11 for it to degenerate into hucksterism. I talked about that in earlier videos. And in elder care, taking care of my mother, I was home with her for the last 7 years of her life. She passed away at the end of 2010, at almost the same time that Don't Ask, Don't Tell was being lifted. Now, there's a chapter at the end of the nonfiction section, which is called an epilogue, that sort of focuses on 4 problems: the upward affiliation, which can kind of be socially destructive if it's scaled by a lot of people. Having skin in the game, in other words, being able to have people who depend on you, meeting their real needs. External instability, the possibility that the world will no longer be democratic, that there will be pandemics, or that there will be war, or climate change, this kind of thing. And particularly a willingness to be open to others in unprecedented ways by sort of stepping up to meeting their needs when there are unusual challenges. Now, I haven't always lived up to that, particularly in a couple of times in 2016, when the issue of asylum seekers came up suddenly or became much bigger. And when there was also an issue of being willing to drive in dangerous areas to deliver food, which I had backed out of. But these pressures can bring up the objects of being open to the idea of sharing sacrifice, just like conscription does. And so that's kind of the other thing that's behind this whole moral line of thinking, is that particularly in the world I grew up in, men were potentially fungible or expendable because they could be drafted to fight wars, and women couldn't be drafted normally to fight wars. They were subordinate. Well, the women took their own risks, but when men were supposed to protect women and children. And if that's going on in some parts of the world, like it is right now, and I don't want to editorialize on Ukraine or on Hamas and Israel right now, but that is going on. When that's going on, that's a problem potentially for anyone in the civilized world, that it could someday present a challenge for them, especially me. Now, the second part of the book is called the fiction section. And the last two chapters were parallel stories called Expedition and the Ocelot the Way Is. The ocelot, which is a cat, a wild cat, is a pseudonym in my vocabulary for a kind of Clark Kent type of person. But and in the second story, there is sort of a heavy price to pay when you meet the ocelot and get invited to go on a trip with it. But that would be a good movie. We can talk about that another time. The main thing that I want to talk about here was that the fiction section also presents chapter 4 of the manuscript called The Proles, which I had talked about last summer. I'll put the date in the notes. Chapter 4 was the detailed description of my time in basic training, which I largely reproduced in this book. There was a transition from my time of being an assistant instructor, finishing my master's orals, which were kind of tenuous in math at the University of Kansas, and then also grading students because I taught them algebra, and flunking some of them and having the ability with male students to increase their risk of the Vietnam draft. And so I, in a sense, had a certain kind of power then at age 24, actually earlier than that, which I've never had since then. And I went from that to going in the Army myself in February of 1968, and then winding up because of my physical condition in special training company for 4 weeks. But I got better, and I actually got so that I was confident enough to pass the PCP. And so some of my problems, my physical problems, got much better in basic, Army basic. Some of my personal habits probably got better, being able to take care of things and so forth, although over the years, that's probably deteriorated my housekeeping habits and so forth. But then I actually got better. And, as a young man, after getting out of the Army, I was for 10 years or so, was more reasonably competitive with what a man should be. And then I started dropping off when I was perhaps in my 40s. But the idea of conscription and the possibility that men can be conscripted drives a lot of my thinking. And I don't make any bones about it. The best position to be in is to be able to do practical things for others and be able to teach yourself the skills where you can and use your own labor as much as possible rather than depend on inherited wealth. And to balance working alone and being able to work with others. It's not all about you. It's not all about just taking care of yourself. It's learning to take care of others in combination with taking care of yourself at the same time. But my father used to say it's about learning to work. I didn't like the idea of learning to work. It sounded subservient. He also used to say that to obey is better than to sacrifice, because sacrifice is real, and we all have what we have today. That are some of us that are better off, and a lot of people don't think they're better off, as we know, with the left and progressivism and so forth. and radicalism. We all know that those of us that have been better off than maybe we could have earned the right to be on our own, sort of have to be aware that we have some of what we have because others have made the ultimate sacrifice in the past. So, my life does raise some questions about my own social credit at an individual level. But the political climate is moving away towards identity politics and demanding reparative measures by groups. And I won't get into detail, but we all know that has to do with critical race theory and to some extent, I guess, critical gender theory now. And giving special treatment, regard to people and maligned or marginalized groups. Now, do I feel like joining up and taking sides if I lose my right to speak for myself, which I very easily can, and I can't assume I'm going to have this audience forever. Can I join others and or are they not good enough for me to be willing to march with them in a protest? That's a very fundamental question. It's very disturbing to me. I can't really give you an answer tonight, but I do kind of want to bring the question up. And so that is what this third book is about. And this is going to be followed up with some more questions that have come up. So that is kind of what I had to say about the third Do Ask, Do Tell book, again, published in 2014. And I'll follow up with some of the issues I've talked about soon. Thank you for listening.